Today on the Artis DM, I'm taking a quick break from my fungal series to show you a quick and easy way to make one of the most quintessential and useful pieces of terrain for any fantasy tabletop RPG. I'm of course referring to the humble wagon. A wagon can be utilized in a multitude of different encounters and scenarios in your tabletop RPG. I kept that in mind when designing this project, and this final piece is going to have interchangeable parts for whatever scenario we need. To make these, all you need are $2 worth of dollar store toys, some XPS foam, and some gemstones. And that's pretty much it. In fact, for the XPS foam, I used cut-offs and scraps from other projects. But before we get into the video, I wanted to quick say that I have a Facebook now for the Artis DM. Just search the Artis DM in Facebook and you should find it. There isn't much to it yet, but I will be posting pictures from the crafting process, the filming process, and other stuff as well. And if you want to message me or ask questions or post your own stuff, it's another spot where you can do that. Again, just search the Artis DM and you should find the page. So without further ado, let's get your tabletop swag on and make a wagon. Ew, doesn't work. Should probably just roll the intro. Begin by looking over the dollar store wagon. This is going to be used as a substructure to give the piece a lot of stability, being that it's going to be used a lot during gameplay. I look over each section and decide if I need to alter it, keep it the way it is, or remove it entirely. The canopy that comes with it has a pretty nice shape, so all I need to do is texture this. The only trimming that I do is cutting off the pegs at the bottom. At this point, I was trying to decide if I wanted to keep the wheels being able to spin or to just lock them in. When I was weighing the pros and cons, it became pretty apparent that it was best to lock them in. That way, if it was on an uneven surface, it would remain stable and in one spot. The wagon comes with this tailgate that can open and close, but I couldn't really see any use for that, so I decided to super glue it shut to add to the overall strength of the substructure. The front rigging section was pretty unsightly and pretty useless for this application, so I decided to move that entire section completely. I'd end up replacing it with my own structure. Before you begin trimming down the piece, make sure you have a nice fresh blade and proceed with some extra caution because you're cutting plastic and sometimes the knife can jump. I started by removing the wheels. If you left the wheels on, it'd be pretty hard to reach them when it came to painting and adding the XPS foam. Be mindful how you're holding it while you're cutting, because as you can see, I was holding it by the back tailgate, which could have caused it to slip in my hand. After removing the wheels, I went in and shaved off any excess plastic. It doesn't need to be perfect, you just don't want any unsightly bumps in the XPS foam. I then did a simple cross cut to remove the entire front segment. And again, I'm being cautious and taking my time and being mindful where I'm placing my hands. I then applied a very liberal amount of super glue to make sure that that back tailgate would not open. I pinched the sides in and held it in place to make sure that it was secure. And for good measure, I added more super glue on the outside of the seam. Using XPS cutoffs, I milled up a bunch of pre-made beams that were the appropriate size and textured them with my wire brush. I personally like to do all my milling first, so then I can completely focus on the build. When it came to deciding where to place the beams, I used the pattern on the toy as a guide and kind of improvised it as I went, leaving the beams long and then trimming them down to where they came together. I decided this piece needed more variation in depth, so using a paintbrush, I rolled the side panels flat. Having those juxtaposed to the frame would add depth, and once the wash is settled, it would really bring that out. To speed things up, I used hot glue for the frame, but then I could use tacky glue because the frame would hold these pieces together. I'm not going to cover the entire process in detail because I basically just covered it up with XPS foam. However, I will mention that on the top I added some width to the beams so the miniatures could stand on the edge. I also added some diagonal supports to have some added detail. To add texture to the canopy, I cut out the appropriate size piece of paper towel. For adhesive, I smeared white glue across the canopy, making sure that all the surface area was covered. It's important to add a liberal amount of white glue to the interior to get a nice secure hold. For the paper towel, I selected the kind that doesn't have a pattern, and I wet it down with some spritz of water. To get a snug fit, I place the canopy in the middle of the paper towel. I then wrap it around the edges on the bottom. Keep working at it until you're satisfied. To have it wrap around really tightly around the thick parts at the end, I had to add some additional white glue. If there's any excess, you can trim it off with scissors. To preserve the texture of the paper towel to make it look like cloth, I didn't add any white glue to the outside. The paint and Krylon spray will be enough to secure it. When it came to the wheels, all I wanted was that circular frame. Instead of keeping the spokes, I decided to cover the wheels with wood planks. Because these are metal, you're going to need some nippers to trim them down. I also cut off the bump on the center outer edge. The rim and the spokes create a recess, so to level that out, I put a very thin piece of XPS foam. Getting rid of that recess will prevent the planks from bowing inward. To attach the planks, I used hot glue. I ran the planks long, and then using the wheel as a guide, I cut along the edge. Any rough spots can be fixed with a file. To make the metal rims, I grabbed a masterpiece of XPS foam and used the wheels to gauge the distance of my fence on my Proxxon cutter. Once I had the appropriate width, I then shaved off very thin strips of XPS foam. To attach the rim, I used a very thin strip of hot glue. goal is to get it as close to a perfect circle as possible. When I approached the end, I let it run long, and then very carefully lined up the ends and made my cut. The rim of the wheels are slanted, so the side that has the largest diameter is much more aesthetically pleasing when it comes to applying the foam, so I put those on the outside of the wagon. To connect each pair of wheels, I cut out a piece of XPS foam to serve as a cross beam. I would later go in and reinforce this with super glue and baking soda. Now time for the harness where the beasts of burden will hook up to. For the main beam, I cut out a relatively thick piece of XPS foam. I shaved off an end to be a metal cap at the end to add some detail. On the other end, I made a slanted cut. This positions the beam at an upward angle. Temporarily place the wheels under the carriage and make sure to line up the angle with the backs of your animals. That way it looks like the harness is resting on the animal. And as you can see, to reinforce the foam, I inserted 2 toothpicks into pre-drilled holes, as far as I could. To see how far I could go, I just pushed the toothpicks as far as I could until they wouldn't go any further. I then drew a line and cut it just shy of that line, so that they wouldn't be protruding from the beam. And of course, secure those in place with some glue. To detail the wheels, I just made 2 cross beams, a square piece of wood, and then one of those cheap gemstones to serve as a piece of metal in the center. And I poked some holes in the cross beams to look like nail holes. I chose to make the wheels like this because it makes the aesthetic rudimentary, like it could be owned by a peasant or a noble. I figured villagers and peasants probably wouldn't have the money to have iron made into spokes and wheels. The connection to the cross beam's flimsy right now, but after they're coated in Mod Podge, I'll go in and add super glue and baking soda to give it a very secure bond. It was at this point I decided I wanted a detachable wheel. So to do so, I cut off one of the wheels. I then took out a small chunk of foam from the interior facing center of the wheel. I placed a segment of a toothpick on there and filled it with hot glue. I would later go in and reinforce that with baking soda and super glue. Then on the cross beam, I drilled a small hole that was slightly smaller than the toothpick. That way it would have some tension and grip when you inserted the toothpick. It's not a fancy mechanism, but it gets the job done. And having that detachable wheel really increases the playability of the wagon. When connecting the cross beam, I cut out 2 segments from each beam. This makes it look like it's a cross slab joint, as if someone that was woodworking made this. To secure it, I added hot glue and then added 2 shortened pins to act as nails. For the part that connects to the horse, I used shoelace and kept it simple. I just placed the horse underneath the beam and measured out how much shoelace I needed. I then tied 2 knots and glued those to the top, so it looked like the harness was going through the beam. At this point, I felt the wagon needed a little bit more embellishment, so I added these diagonal support beams and added a little bit of a curve to them to break up all the right angles. And with that, all the structures are done. We can move on to paint and then connect the wheels after that. To begin the painting process, I covered the entire thing in a mixture of black paint and Mod Podge. To make the wood look like it's been weathered by the outside elements, I utilized Black Magic Crafts technique. If you haven't tried this yet, his Gallows episode goes in depth on how to do this. And at least with the way I do it, I find that it takes multiple coats of that watered down base coat to get it to where you need it. Once the paper towel on the canopy had dried, I base coated it in linen from Folkart. Then for dry brushing, I went in with a mixture of that with pure white. And after that, I went in with one more additional layer of dry brushing with even more pure white mixed in. I painted the metal parts with gunmetal silver and then dry brushed the wood with suede. I wasn't worried about some of the dry brushing getting on the metal because I'd go back in and touch it up. To do so, I just used a fine tip brush and went in and painted the parts that were affected. And don't forget to do that metal cap at the end of the main beam and the 2 nails on the cross beam. I started applying the black wash and then decided that I should probably attach the wheels at this point so the black wash would get into the nooks where the cross beams meet the wagon. I took care to make sure they were attached at right angles and to make sure they weren't too far apart or too close to the middle. Before applying the wash to the canopy, I clear coated it in Krylon's matte varnish. Once the varnish dried, I went in with a watered down brown wash, afraid that the brown wash would make it too dark with all the white colors. However, after some experimentation, I found out that the full strength wash was just fine. When it comes to the horses, just spray paint them in some primer and paint them up like you would a Mini. And with that, this project is done. This was a fun and low stress project. It didn't require anything too complex and it was pretty quick to make. You could do this in one session easily. After building this, you have your own versatile, aesthetically pleasing, and sturdy wagon for many D&D sessions to come. And with a detachable wheel and canopy, you can use this in a lot of different scenarios. And as always, if you like what you saw here, please subscribe, hit that like button, because I got a lot more videos coming. For those of you waiting for the conclusion to the modular fungal forest, it's in the works right now, and as soon as it's ready, I'll post it up on YouTube. But until then, thanks for watching, and keep on crafting.